Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmiri, thanking you for joining us today for today's discussion in our series focused on the US-China relationship and its global implications, as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. If you have any questions for today's guest, please feel free to submit them using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. After the live event, you can also listen to these programs on your favorite podcast platform. Reminder, Polaris Live is a non-commercial, user-supported channel. You are the reason we are here. Your support is vital to our work and is the reason we can continue to produce our unbiased, cutting-edge discussions of the most consequential relationship in the world. Please go to my website, kashmiri.com, to subscribe and show your support. Thank you, and thank you for being part of this conversation. Just a few years ago, at a huge and exuberant Texas rally for the Indian Prime Minister, the rallying cry was, "Howdy Modi," and India was the ace in America's plans to create a foil to China's growing dominance. Since then, the relationship seems to have instead morphed to hasta la vista, baby, a farewell to those grand US-Indian dreams. Prime Minister Modi's Make in India plans have collided with the Trump administration's Make in America plans with potentially explosive results. The two countries' national interests don't seem to be synchronous anymore, or is this more hype than reality? After all, America is still the world's export destination. To help us think through these contentious and contradictory issues, we are joined today from New Delhi, India, by Mr. Ajay Srivastava, the well-known Indian trade expert. Mr. Srivastava is the founder, Global Trade Research Initiative, an Indian research group specializing in technology, climate change, and trade. He served as a senior Indian Trade Service Officer to help India in its World Trade Organization, bilateral and free trade agreement negotiations. He was part of the Indian team's negotiations with ASEAN, Japan, Korea, Australia, EU, writes regularly for the Indian media, including Business Standard, The Hindu, Times of India. He's the author of books such as Stop Talking, Start Exporting, The GST Nation, Business Guide to Foreign Trade Agreements. Welcome back to Polaris Live, Ajay. So glad to have you with us again.
Thanks, Sarwar. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, the US is still pressuring India to make long-term trade commitments under the threat of reciprocal tariffs. But the US Supreme Court struck down the American reciprocal tariffs, held them to be illegal. Help us, Ajay, understand how India is dealing with this weird situation.
Sarwar, it's not only India, it's almost all the trading partners of the US, they are dealing with this. So what happened is, let's go back to April 2025, when Mr. Trump launched his reciprocal tariffs. And he charged different reciprocal tariffs on different trading partners. For example, on Europe, he charged 15%. On India, he charged 25%. He doubled it to 50% later. And Japan, 15%, UK, 10%. So different tariffs were charged. And then he set out to negotiate a quick trade deal, which was not approved by the Congress, but just between president and the partner country. The trade deal means from the US side, Mr. Trump will lower its reciprocal tariff on that country. For example, on EU, it will be lowered to 15%. On Japan, it will be lowered to 15% again. For UK, 10%. For India, from 25% to 18%. In return, all these trading partners have to give a lot to the US. A lot means, for example, European Union, it committed to buy $750 billion worth of energy from the US, cut import tariffs on most of the agriculture products and almost all industrial products. Same deal with Japan, same with UK. Malaysia, Vietnam, everybody did this deal. And Indian deal, the contours was announced on February 6th. Then
Hmm.
what, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court, it put a lid on the reciprocal tariff on their judgment on February 20th. The US Supreme Court affirmed the decisions of the lower two courts, Federal Court and the Court of International Trade. So Supreme Court said the US president doesn't have power to impose tariffs just because US has a trade deficit with a particular partner country. Trade deficits are not national emergencies, and national unless there is a national emergency, the act which he used, the International Emergency Economic Power Act, doesn't empower the president to impose tariff. So, in short, Supreme Court says nothing doing. You can't impose reciprocal tariff. They must go. So instead, reciprocal tariffs are illegal. Now this changed everything. This means the US side of bargain was gone. US was lowering the reciprocal tariff to get concessions from the partner countries. Now there was no US side concessions. It's gone.
Hmm.
So US realized this, and now they thought countries will be walking out of the trade deals. So Malaysia, for example, it saw that you do a deal with the US, give so many concessions, and you have to pay 10% tariffs, which were later imposed. If you don't do a trade deal, no concessions you give to US, still you pay 10%. So deal or no deal, you pay 10%. So deal lost all the meaning. So Malaysia walked out of it. Many other countries they thought of or thinking of.
Ajay, let me interrupt, please. Did I hear you say that Malaysia walked out of this negotiation deal?
So Malaysia signed a trade deal with the US
Yes.
based on US lowering their reciprocal tariffs. When a Supreme Court judgment came, Malaysia could see, like other countries, that the US side of bargain is lost.
Hmm.
It's has become totally one-sided, where Malaysia will be giving a lot of concessions and US will not be giving any concessions. So Malaysia walked out of the trade deal.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's the position with most of the US trading partners, including India.
Okay. So, but now on top of this, the U.S. Has now added additional tariffs on India and other import trading partners to address the importation of goods made with forced labor. How does India view this? Is this really a way to circumvent the Supreme Court ruling? How are you folks dealing with this?
So it's not only India. When the US saw that reciprocal tariffs do not exist, and countries like Malaysia they walked out, others will soon be walking out, or
Hmm.
India may not even conclude the trade deal. It had to create some pressure. So it launched investigations on forced labor and excess industrial capacity, not only against India, but 60 economies, including Japan, China, European Union, India, and many other countries, Pakistan, many other countries. And the results of the forced labor investigations have almost come. It proposes 12.5% tariffs on 54 countries. On the 10 on remaining six countries imposes 10% tariffs. So almost all the countries have been proposed to be levied 12.5% tariffs, including India. Now these countries will have to go and convince US why it should lower those tariffs or not take them at all, which
Hmm.
means US will be asking for its own pound of flesh, that you stay tuned with the trade negotiations you were doing. Let's conclude them fast.
Wow. How does anybody make sense of this? But we still continue to hear the U.S. has been making more and more trade concessions for India. Is this true, Ajay, or has that stopped?
No, there is this is not true. And right now, India, along with all other countries, have to, if they are exporting to US, have to pay the regular tariffs, which are called most favored nation tariffs, plus 10% tariffs, which were imposed under Section 122. All countries have same tariffs they face. India doesn't have any special tariffs now.
But 1 year ago, you argued that it is time for India to pause the trade dialogue with the US, reassess its trade strategy. Has your advice changed since then? Has India moved along that path that you were proposing?
So, server trade negotiations, they are not charity. Even if I can open my economy for the US, I can do this if I get something in return. The
Hmm.
return side, it doesn't exist for the US right now. It's only threats of imposing more tariffs. Initially, at least, even though reciprocal tariff were there. They were WTO incompatible, but they existed. They were physical obstacles to exporting to US. But right now, nothing is there. So only threats are there. For example, 12.5% tariffs. US says it will impose on forced labor. India has very clear forced labor laws that we don't allow, we don't tolerate forced labor. So what US says, okay, I know India doesn't use forced labor, but when India imports from some other countries, does it check properly? If I'm importing something from the third country, I can only make a fair guess.
Right.
US attributes this to China, but US is the biggest importer from China. It should stop its imports from China if it cares so much about the forced labor. But it gets everything from China. So this is all forced labor is just a name, it's just a sticker to intimidate countries for imposing tariffs so that they can go and give a lot of concessions to US.
So, Ajay, some 98% of global trade worth over $35 trillion dollars is governed by the World Trade Organization. From what you've just told me and from the Indian perspective, is the WTO still the necessary, irreplaceable mechanism to encourage world trade, to make it follow orderly rules, or do you think the U.S. Unilateral action over the last few months has done some real damage to the WTO, and it's not as necessary anymore? You've done WTO negotiations, and I wanted to ask you this question.
So I'll let me respond in three parts. First part, the current situation is that if we forget about the US, about 80% of the world trade, when it happens, countries charge custom duties on each other's goods.
Right.
Those duties, they still comply with the WTO rules. US is the only country which is violating WTO rules. Everybody else, all the world trade, more than 80%, takes place, which is today also conforms to the WTO commitments of the countries. That's point number one. So, despite the US non-complying with the WTO rules, everybody else is complying. Number two is US uh, has almost destroyed the appellate panel, which means earlier in a WTO, if two countries were having dispute on some trade matter, they were going to WTO, and in WTO there was a dispute settlement panel where verdicts were obtained. Many verdicts went against the US. So US has destroyed that mechanism. So that mechanism is destroyed. Appellate panel does not exist at the WTO. So if two countries they fight against each other on trade rule, WTO cannot arbitrate against that. That's the thing that US has done. And
Hmm.
now many new issues are being discussed in WTO. So on one hand, appellate panel has been maimed by the US. On the other hand, many new issues countries are taking up in WTO, and members are not reaching anywhere because that fundamental force is missing. So I say the current trade, more than 80% uses WTO rules, but future developments are not happening. For example, in this MC14, Ministerial Conference 14, which happened at Cameroon in the March last week, then the countries could not even issue a single piece of paper as common agreement.
Hmm.
Even things like very simple things on which we all agreed for the past 50, 60 years, we could not agree this time. So WTO is under stress, but I say the silver lining is that 80% of the world trade still honors the WTO commitments of the countries except the US, and that's where we are in the WTO.
But, Ajay, realistically speaking, the American economy is the largest importer economy, right? Every country has to sell to America to really gain for their people standards of living and so on. So, I mean, to some extent, doesn't America pretty much rule the rules under which the WTO can operate? Or am I exaggerating this? Or will the pressure from the rest of the world really damage the trade that America thrives on also?
So I say, except for America, everybody else is following the
Yes,
WTO rule. Everybody else, including Europe, Australia, India, China, everybody is following.
absolutely.
And two things may happen. That one is people may be waiting for Mr. Trump to go and see how US behaves, next president behaves about the WTO,
Okay.
because uh, if US as a country decides that WTO should not exist, then WTO will be is already weakened and it may go, and we'll go back to the time when import duties were decided bilaterally between two countries. I mean, the stronger country always won. WTO equalized the condition of everybody to the extent that island country will challenge US and still win the case in the WTO based on the argument's merit. So we have to see. We cannot say right now. The good point is that still most of the countries are following the WTO rules. Bad point is that nothing new is happening in the WTO. Bad point is that two countries are fighting. They cannot decide. They cannot rely on the WTO to decide about the fate of the case. So, but we have to wait. I think once Mr. Trump goes, then we'll have a clear view how WTO is going to survive in the current form or in much changed form.
So, shifting gears a bit, India's trade deficit with China now is estimated to exceed 100 billion, the largest that it's ever been. A clear trend that seems to reveal the world's most populous nation's growing economic dependence on the world's second most popular country, China. In spite of the Himalayan military confrontation, the two are getting even more closely aligned in the trade field. So I'm asking you, if this is true, it seems to be a real dichotomy, right? The world is thinking, at least the Western world, that China and India are at daggers drawn, but on the other hand, they're getting closely aligned with trade. Can you jump in the middle of this and help us straighten this out, Ajay?
So India and China had tough moment as far as border issues were concerned. Some skirmishes, some small war, 6 years back at Galwan, where the armies of both the sides they fought. But even during Galwan time, the trade was flowing in a totally uninterrupted fashion. India issues some some made some small laws that will scrutinize Chinese investment, but trade, which means exports and imports, buy and sell of
Right.
the goods, it continued in a totally uninterrupted way. Pre Galwan, post Galwan, there was no change. And our deficit or imports from China, they're rising continuously. For example, 5 years back, the deficit was just $45 billion. Now it's $111 billion. So it's rising and rising very fast. Our imports from China are exceeding $130 billion. Imports are $131 billion. Exports
Hmm.
are barely $30 billion. So I said on trade front, both the countries, I mean, the trade is flowing in a totally uninterrupted way, whatever is the position at the political level. But trade, we need goods from China, and that's why we continue buying more and more.
Well, I also ask this because, there was a time not long ago that America believed that its foreign policy needed to woo India to develop it as a counter against the growth of China. And so this kind of puts the wrench in the gear work, doesn't it? Because now that option doesn't seem to be as present as it was just 3 years ago.
So America was never clear about this. Of course, there was a talk that America, for example, through instruments like Quad, it wants to present a big, almost anti-China, counter to China
Yes.
front, including India, Japan, Australia, etc. But it remained at the discussion level. Nothing tangible could ever happen. For example, the most talked about subject was supply chain resilience, China plus one, or critical mineral policy. But it remained on the talk level, framework level, MOU level, but nothing serious has happened on the ground. America, much more than India, is dependent on China, for example, for supply of critical minerals. India is also totally dependent. Others also totally dependent. So on the field, you have to do something at the physical level to minimize that dependence. America is not ready for that. I'll give you one very small example. For example, India wanted American companies and other companies also to assemble laptops in India 3 years back,
Yes.
and right now most of them they are making it in China. So we restricted the import of laptop. We decided to restrict, not restricted, but so the pressure came from American side, not from Chinese side, that why you are doing this, don't restrict it. So on one hand, America wants to create a front against China. On the other hand, if any country is taking firm concrete steps in that direction, America is the one who is opposing, because some dollar loss may accrue to its own companies who are operating in China. So I think America was never clear about anti-China front, and now I think it's almost gone.
Just to complicate this discussion we're having a few moments ago, in spite of everything we've just discussed, right, the U.S. recently sold one of its most prized weapon system, this surveillance drone, to the Indian Navy, almost $4 billion or so. So in spite of all the trade difficulties and so on, India seems to be able to, within its own domestic politic, do this kind of military trade with America. Has this surprised you, or is this just reality taking its course?
So India has diversified its buying of the defense equipment. It buys from Russia, it buys from France, it buys from Germany, it buys little bit from US also. So I don't give much credence to it. High quality strategic drones are available from many countries. India
Hmm.
must have bought from US. I don't give much credence to this, because we buy defense equipment from many countries, including the US.
So, Ajay, tell me, why does India refuse to follow the US and Europe sanctions regimen against buying Russian oil? Doesn't India want to support Ukraine?
So, so server, if we go back into the history, you see US is has played the largest role that initiated the war between Russia and Ukraine. How they pushed Europe into the war. It's the if we go to 2005 6 development, 2014 15 developments, how you deposed the president of Ukraine who was not listening to you, to bring a person who was listening to you to incite the war. US is behind the war, and they say India is supporting. So I say India is not supporting the war. India is just, as a sovereign country, it's buying energy from whatever country it suits. Russia is one of those countries. Russia has additionally been India's trusted strategic partner, military partner also in the past. So in the past, we have seen that US, when India had any problems with, say, Pakistan, the US was always standing with Pakistan. Russia was always standing with India. But this is not the issue of those things. I say, as a sovereign nation, I have the right to buy oil or anything from any country. US has no role to play in that. And by making stories like by buying oil from Russia and supporting Ukraine war, US should say this to China, who is a bigger buyer of oil from Russia. US will dare not tell this thing to China if same logic applies. So it's all to pressurize. If any country takes the pressure, like India seems to be taking pressure from Mr. Trump, they are talking all these things. They will dare not talk all these things to China.
So, Ajay, do you think that your views, as you've so clearly expressed, is pretty much the sentiment that is in India, that most people, this is how they are thinking?
I cannot talk on behalf of people of India, but this is commonsensical when I talk to my group, larger group. Then everybody finds this very commonsensical that two sovereign countries are doing. Who is US to poke its nose into this? That's the issue.
So now, Ajay, before we run out of time, I did want to explore with you this idea that is reaching center stage of the active non-alignment policy, where instead of just being non-aligned, the non-aligned nations can now use this competition between America and China for their own national interest. So they can have different things. They ask one person different thing to the other party based on what they would like to get done for their own national interest. So I'm going to just ask you, do you have any advice looking at the environment that you're seeing now for the global south and the non-aligned nations? Can they really take advantage of the China-US confrontation? What advice would you give them? Because India seems to be threading its way fairly successfully within this ambit.
So I say India and most other countries, they should forget about US-China rivalry. We don't know whether they are rivals. They are dependent on each other for so many things. And we should forget about US-China rivalry and focus inward on the development of our own countries. We should have a good relationship with both US and China and not go too near. We cannot have relation with one country at the expense of other. So we have to have good relations with all countries, should not play US against China, should not even think on those terms. We have to focus on our own development. For that reason, if we have to do certain strategic tie-up with certain countries, that's most welcome. But we should not align ourselves with any of the big power groups.
But Ajay, realistically, and this will be my last question, realistically, there is a size difference between most non-aligned global South countries and China and America. So isn't there a limit to which they can follow this line that you have just proposed? Or should they think also for joining together in groups that can together follow this line that you're proposing?
So loose groups for certain common subjects of interest. For example, BRICS is there. So BRICS doesn't talk about all the subjects among the member countries. It will talk about cooperation in certain subjects. So that, such groups are most welcome, but it should be very clear that they should not be acting in a way that hurts their relations with China or US. That should be very clear.
Well, Ajay Srivastava, we have, alas, run out of time. Thank you so very much for taking the time to help our global audience think through this complex, new US-driven global trade environment, its impact on China and the world. I hope you'll come back and see us again.
Thank you, Sarwar.
And thank you to our viewers from around the world. Join us again on Polaris-Live.com as we continue to explore the most consequential relationship of our time, that between the United States and China and its impact on the world. Until our next show then, goodbye.